A fist shot toward a man's face. It came fast, a straight punch aimed dead center, but it never landed. Something moved. A hand flicked up, turned the wrist aside, and the attacker stumbled forward into empty air. He caught himself, spun around, and swung again. Same result. He hit nothing but air. The room full of black belts went dead silent. Grown men who had trained their whole lives just stood there, staring at the mat. And on that mat, barely moving, stood a young instructor in a black training uniform. He weighed maybe 135 pounds soaking wet. His name was Bruce Lee. And in that room, in the summer of 1967, he was about to do something the film camera in the back row could barely even capture. What did those men see that made them stop breathing? Stay with me on this one. Now let me back up and tell you how a moment like this even happens, because it didn't happen on a stage with lights and a big announcement. It happened almost by accident in a side hall in front of maybe 40 people, and most of them didn't want to be there. The place was Long Beach, California, the Long Beach International Karate Championships. Back in those days, this was the biggest martial arts event in the whole country. Fighters came from everywhere. Karate men, judo men, kung fu men. Big trophies, big egos, and a whole lot of pride packed into one convention hall. If you were serious about the fighting arts in America, this was where you showed up. You came to prove something. And in 1967, most of these men had already made up their minds about Bruce Lee. See, by that summer, Lee had a reputation. Not the reputation you're thinking of. Not the movie star, that was still years away. In 1967, he was just a young Chinese instructor from a little school, and half the people in that hall thought he was a loudmouth. He talked too much. He criticized the old ways. He said classical forms were a waste of time. He said if you couldn't use it in a real fight, it was just dancing. To a room full of men who had spent 20 years perfecting those exact forms, that was fighting words. So there was tension in the building before anything even started. You could feel it. Now there was a man there that day named Harold Dennison. Everybody called him Hal. Hal was a tournament official. He'd been around martial arts for years, worked the tables, kept the brackets, made sure the trophies got to the right hands. He wasn't a great fighter himself, and he'd tell you that straight out, but he'd seen everybody. He'd seen the best in the country come through those doors. And Hal is the reason we know about any of this. Because Hal had something in his hands that day that nobody thought much about at the time. A little 8mm movie camera, the kind you wound up with a crank. He'd brought it to film the trophy ceremony. That's it. That was the whole plan. But here's the thing about Bruce Lee. He wasn't scheduled for a real demonstration that afternoon. There was a slot on the program, sure, but the main event was somewhere else. What happened with Lee happened in an overflow room off to the side, where a handful of black belts had gathered around because word had spread. Somebody said the Chinese kid was going to show a few things, and a lot of them came just to watch him fall on his face. Hal followed the crowd because that was his job, watching the crowd. And he brought the camera because he never put it down. When Lee walked in, he wasn't loud. That surprised people. He came in quiet with a gear bag over his shoulder, and next to him, walking calm as anything, was a big German shepherd. That dog's name was Bobo. Beautiful animal. Bobo went straight to the corner by the gear bag, lay down, and stayed there the whole time. Didn't bark. Didn't move. Just watched with those dark eyes like he'd seen this 100 times before. And later, some of the men said that dog unnerved them more than Lee did, because the dog wasn't nervous. The dog knew. He set his bag down. He looked around the room slow, taking in every face. And Hal said you could see him counting the doubters. He wasn't angry about it. If anything, he looked almost amused. Then Lee spoke. And what he said set the whole thing in motion. He said in that clear voice of his, "I don't want to talk about it. Talking is easy. Everybody talks." He looked at the black belts lined up along the wall. "So let's not talk. Let one of you come here and try to hit me. Any way you like. As hard as you like, and we'll see what happens. Now let me tell you, that changed the temperature in that room instantly. Because a demonstration is one thing. A man saying, "Come hit me as hard as you can," in front of your peers, with your reputation on the line. That's a challenge, that's real. And there was no shortage of men in that hall who wanted to be the one to knock this cocky kid down. Hal lifted the camera to his eye. He didn't even think about it. Something told him this was worth catching. His hands were sweating on the crank, and through that little viewfinder he saw the first volunteer step forward. The man was a karate black belt, solid, confident. He'd won matches that weekend. He rolled his shoulders, walked out onto the mat, and stood across from Lee like he already knew how it was going to go. That's where our story really begins. The first man squared up. He was maybe 6 feet, well over 180 pounds, and he moved like he trusted his body. He'd done this 10,000 times. He set his feet, raised his hands, and told Lee, "Go ahead when you're ready." Lee just stood there, relaxed, arms loose at his sides. He wasn't even in a fighting stance. And that alone made a few men in the room shift on their feet, because that's not how you're taught. You never stand loose in front of a puncher. You guard up. Lee didn't guard anything. A couple of the black belts along the wall traded looks, the kind of look that says, "This kid is about to learn something the hard way." They'd seen loose hands get broken jaws. He said, "No, you hit me. You try to hit my face. Go." The black belt didn't need to be told twice. He fired a straight punch, a real one, the kind meant to land. And here's where the film, when Hal finally showed it decades later, gets strange. Because on that grainy little reel you can see the punch start. You can see the arm extend. And then Lee's head is just not there. There's no big movement, no dramatic dodge. His head shifts a couple of inches and the fist sails past his ear, and before the man can even pull his arm back, Lee's palm is resting flat against his cheek. Not a strike, a tap, a pat, almost gentle. As if to say, "I could have ended you right there, but I won't." The man froze. He stepped back and tried again. Faster this time, a combination, 1-2. Lee slipped the first, redirected the second with the back of his wrist, and tapped the man twice more, cheek, then chest. The black belt stumbled sideways off balance, caught himself, and just stood there breathing hard. And you have to understand, this wasn't some beginner. This was a man who'd knocked out other black belts that same weekend. He was good. And he'd just been made to look like he'd never thrown a punch in his life. The room made a sound, not applause, more like a collective exhale. 40 men who had come to see a kid embarrassed, and instead they just watched their own guy get handled like a child. Now Bruce Lee did not gloat. That's important. He didn't laugh at the man. He put a hand on his shoulder and said something quiet, something like, "Good, that was good, thank you." And the black belt, to his credit, nodded and stepped back into the crowd. He wasn't humiliated. He was converted. You could see it on his face. But not everyone in that room was ready to believe. Because there's always someone who says that was a fluke, that was cooperation. He knew the punch was coming. In a real fight, it'd be different. And Hal, standing there with the camera whirring, heard exactly those words muttered from the back of the room. He recognized the voice. And he knew that voice belonged to trouble. Lee heard it too. He turned toward the sound. He said, calm as ever, "You don't believe it, come. Come and show everyone how it's really done." So a second man came out, bigger than the first. This one wasn't just a black belt, he was known. He'd placed in the tournament. He had a following, and he came out onto the mat with a different look in his eyes. The first man wanted to test Lee. This man wanted to hurt him. Lee saw that too, and he didn't back off an inch. What followed, Hal said, was the part people had the hardest time believing, because the second man was fast, genuinely fast. He came in with a flurry, hands and feet driving forward, trying to overwhelm, and Lee moved. For the first time that day, Lee actually moved, and it was like watching water go around a rock. He didn't block much. He wasn't there. Punch after punch found nothing, and every time the man overcommitted, Lee's hand would touch him. forehead, ribs, the side of the neck. Little touches, reminders, each one saying dead, dead, dead. And the harder the man pushed, the calmer Lee got. That was the thing that rattled people. Most men, when you come at them fast, they tense up. Lee slowed down. He had all the time in the world. Then Lee did the thing that people still argue about. He held up one hand and said, "Stop. Just stop for a second." The man, breathing hard, stopped. And Lee said, "Now stand still. Don't move. Try to block this." He put his own fist about a foot from the man's chest, just held it there. Told him, "Block it. I'm going to touch your chest. Block it if you can." And the film shows it. Hal caught the whole thing. Lee's fist is there, and then it's on the man's chest, and the arm barely blurs. The man never even flinched in time. He didn't move to block until after the touch had already happened. Twice more Lee did it from a dead stop, no wind-up, and twice more the man couldn't react in time. Think about what that means. The man knew it was coming. He was told exactly where. He was staring right at the fist, and he still couldn't get a hand up in time. It wasn't strength. The man was much stronger. It was speed. Speed like nobody in that room had ever seen up close. By now the muttering had stopped completely. Even the loudmouth in the back was quiet. And here's where the day should have ended. Here's where it should have been a nice story, a legend passed around, the kind of thing old fighters tell over coffee. Lee thanked the second man. He stepped back to the corner where Bobo lay waiting, and the big dog lifted his head. Lee reached down into his gear bag and pulled out a towel. He wiped his face, slow and easy. Somebody handed him a cup of water and he took a sip. The room started to relax. Men were talking again, low and impressed. A couple came forward to shake his hand. It felt over. It felt like everybody had gotten what they came for, one way or another, and now they'd file out and go back to the main hall for the trophies. Hal actually lowered his camera. He figured that was it. He figured he had his little reel of the Chinese kids showing off, and that was a fine thing to have, and he started thinking about winding down. Bobo put his head back on his paws. Lee smiled at something someone said. It was calm. It was done. And that's exactly when the door at the back of the room opened. A man walked in. And the whole feeling of the room changed in about 2 seconds. He was big, not karate tournament big, different. This man filled the doorway. Thick neck, wide shoulders, a flat expression that didn't move at all. He wasn't wearing a training uniform. He was in street clothes, and he walked with the slow, heavy confidence of a man who had actually hurt people for real and not on a mat. Hal said the temperature in that room dropped 10 degrees the moment he came in. Somebody near Hal whispered a name, and whatever that name was, Hal never repeated it out loud, not even decades later when he finally told the story. He'd only say the man was, in his words, not a tournament fighter. A different kind of man entirely. The kind of man who settled things in parking lots and alleys. And he had heard from somebody that some young instructor was in the side room making fools out of black belts, and he did not like it. Word travels fast in a building like that. Somebody had walked out to the main hall and told him, and he'd come to put a stop to it. He walked to the edge of the mat and he looked Lee up and down like Lee was nothing. And he said, "You've been playing games with these boys. Play a game with me." Now understand what just happened here. This was no longer a demonstration. The first 2 men, they wanted to test him or beat him, but they were part of the same world. There were rules, even unspoken ones. Nobody was going to seriously injure anybody at a martial arts tournament in front of 40 witnesses. But this man was not part of that world. This man had come in from outside, and he had come with intent. This was no longer about proving a point in front of your peers. This was about a stranger who wanted to physically break Bruce Lee to make an example of him. The whole nature of the thing had changed. It went from a lesson to a real threat right there in the space of one open door, and Lee knew it. You can see it on the film. His posture changed. The playful ease was gone. He set the water cup down slow. Bobo lifted his head again, and this time the dog stood up. A low sound came out of that shepherd, not a bark, just a warning deep in the chest. Lee said one word to the dog, "Quiet," and Bobo sat back down. But he stayed alert. The men along the wall pressed back to give them room. Nobody was talking now. Hal's hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped the camera, but he raised it back up to his eye because some instinct told him whatever happened next, the world needed to see it. And I'll tell you what happened next in just a second. But first, real quick, if you've made it this far, if you're still with me, do me one small favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one, real footage, real witnesses, the moments the history books skip right over. That's what we do here. So subscribe and stick around. Because what Hal caught on that little reel in the next 90 seconds is the reason he kept it hidden in a shoebox for the rest of his life. Now, back to that room. The big man didn't wait for permission. He didn't square up polite like the black belts had. He just came. He walked straight at Lee and threw a punch that Hal said would have taken a normal man's head clean off. No warning, full power, straight for the jaw. And this is the moment on the film that made grown men go quiet decades later when Hal finally played it. Lee wasn't there. Again. But this time it was different because this time it was real, and this time Lee didn't just tap him and let him go. Lee slipped inside the punch, and his hand shot out and caught the big man by the wrist, and in the same motion he stepped in close and drove the heel of his other palm up under the man's chin. Not full force. Even then, even against a man who wanted to hurt him, Lee held back, but it was enough. The big man's head snapped back and his knees buckled and he sat down hard on the mat. He was up almost immediately, and now he was angry. Now it was personal. He came in a second time, wild, swinging with both hands, trying to grab, trying to grapple, to use his size and pin Lee against the wall where speed wouldn't matter. That was the smart play, honestly. Get in close, take away the room to move. And for 1 second it looked like it might work. The man got a hand on Lee's collar, and that's when Lee did the thing. The thing that Hal spent the rest of his life trying to describe to people who hadn't seen it. The thing that on the film happened so fast you have to slow the reel down to even catch it. Lee dropped his weight, twisted, and hit the man 3 times in the space of about half a second. Body, body, and then a short punch straight up the center that traveled maybe 6 inches. That last one, that's the famous one, the punch that barely moves but carries the whole body's weight behind it. It landed square in the man's solar plexus. The big man made a sound like all the air left him at once. He folded forward. His hands came off Lee's collar. And then this huge, dangerous man, this man who had walked in like he owned the world, dropped to his knees on the mat in front of 40 witnesses. He knelt there, gasping, one hand on the floor, unable to stand, unable to breathe, unable to do a single thing. And Bruce Lee stepped back. He didn't finish him. He didn't hit him again. He didn't say a word to gloat. He just stepped back and he stood there, loose and calm, exactly the way he'd stood at the very beginning of the whole thing, and he waited to see if the man wanted more. The man did not want more. Hal said the silence in that room after that was the loudest silence he'd ever heard in his life. 40 men, not one of them making a sound. The only thing you could hear was the big man on his knees, trying to get his breath back. And that little camera, whirring away in Hal's shaking hands, catching every frame. The big man finally got one knee up. Then he stood slow, holding his ribs, and everybody in that room tensed because they thought maybe now, humiliated, he'd pull something, reach for something. Men like that don't take losing well, but he didn't. He straightened up as best he could and he looked at Lee for a long moment. And then he did something nobody expected. He nodded. Just once. A short, respectful nod, the kind one hard man gives another when the matter is settled and settled fair. And he turned and walked out the way he came, one hand pressed to his stomach the whole way. The door closed behind him. and the room came back to life all at once. A rush of voices, everybody talking over everybody, and Lee just walked over to the corner and knelt down next to Bobo and scratched the big dog behind the ears like nothing at all had happened. That was the whole thing. Maybe 12 minutes start to finish. 3 men, 1 reel of film, and a young instructor who had just proven in the most undeniable way possible that everything he'd been saying was true. Hal Dennison lowered his camera. His hands, he said, didn't stop shaking for an hour. Now here's where the story takes the turn that makes it more than just a good fight tale. Because Hal took that reel home, and he never developed it right away. He was almost afraid of it. He told his wife what he'd seen, and she didn't quite believe him, and he realized pretty quick that nobody was going to believe him. How do you explain to somebody who wasn't there that you watched a 135-pound man drop a genuine street brawler to his knees with a punch that traveled 6 inches? It sounds like a fish story. It sounds like the kind of thing men make up. So Hal did something strange. He put the reel in a shoebox, and he put the shoebox on a shelf in his closet. And he left it there, for decades. Now this was before Bruce Lee became Bruce Lee. Remember that. In 1967, Lee was a controversial young teacher that half the martial arts world thought was arrogant. Nobody knew he'd become the most famous martial artist who ever lived. Nobody knew he'd be gone by 1973, dead at just 32 years old before most of the world even learned his name. When all that happened, when Lee became a legend and then a myth, Hal was sitting on a piece of film of the man in his prime, doing the exact thing that made him a legend, caught by accident in a side room. And still he didn't come forward. And people have asked why. Why would a man sit on something like that? Hal explained it once, near the end of his life, and I think it's the truest thing in this whole story. He said, after Bruce died, everybody had a Bruce Lee story. Everybody. Every man who ever stood in the same building as him suddenly had a tale about the time Bruce Lee did something impossible. And I didn't want to be one of those men. I had the real thing, and I was afraid that if I brought it out, it'd get lumped in with all the lies. I'd rather keep the truth in a box than watch it turn into another tall tale. So he kept it through the 70s, through the 80s. The shoebox moved from house to house, his wife passed, his kids grew up and moved away, and that little reel of 8 film sat in the dark, holding 12 minutes that the rest of the world would have given anything to see. Hal got old, and somewhere in there he started to feel the weight of it, because he understood something. He understood that when he died, that box might get thrown out with everything else. Some estate sale, some dumpster, and the only clean footage of that private exchange would be gone forever. He'd kept the truth safe his whole life, but keeping it safe wasn't the same as saving it. And that's the thing about the men who witness history. Sometimes they don't understand that carrying it alone means it dies with them. So finally, an old man now, Hal took the shoebox down off the shelf one last time. His hands weren't much steadier than they'd been that day in 1967, but for a different reason now. He found somebody he trusted, somebody who knew how to handle old film, how to clean it and scan it and bring it back to life without destroying it. And he sat down and he watched it, projected large for the first time in almost 50 years. And he wept. This tough old tournament official who'd seen everything sat in the dark and cried like a boy, because there was Bruce Lee, young, alive, moving faster than the film could catch. Exactly the way Hal remembered him, exactly the way nobody had believed. The palm on the cheek, the touch on the chest from a foot away, the big man dropping to his knees, all of it right there, undeniable, saved. He said watching it felt like the young man had stepped back into the room, like no time had passed at all. When the footage finally surfaced, it did exactly what Hal had feared and hoped for both. Some people said it couldn't be real. Some people picked it apart frame by frame. That's fine. That's what people do. But the ones who knew, the old fighters who were still around, the ones who understood what they were looking at. They went quiet the same way that room went quiet in 1967. Because you cannot fake the way that big man folded. You cannot fake the speed of that 6-inch punch. You can only catch it by accident in a side room on a little camera, in the shaking hands of a man who happened to be looking the right way at the right time. And here's what the footage really reveals. It's not the fight. The fight is remarkable, sure. But the thing that stays with you, the thing Hal himself said mattered most, is what Lee did after. Every single time. He never once finished a man he'd beaten. He tapped them and let them go. He put a hand on their shoulder. He stepped back and gave them the chance to walk away with something still intact. Even the street brawler who came in wanting to break him, Lee dropped him and then stood down. He held back power he clearly had. That's the part the skeptics never talk about, and it's the part that tells you who the man actually was. It's easy to be fast. It's easy to be strong. What's rare, what's almost impossible, is having all that power in your hands and choosing, over and over, not to use the last of it. That's the thing the film caught that no highlight reel ever will. Hal passed away not long after the footage came out, but he went knowing it was safe. He went knowing that the thing he'd witnessed with his own eyes, the thing nobody believed, was finally out where it couldn't be lost. He'd carried it for 50 years, and at the very end, he set it down where the whole world could pick it up. And that big German shepherd, Bobo, the one who stood up and growled low when the danger walked in and then sat right back down at one quiet word, that dog had it figured out from the start. He wasn't nervous, because he knew there was nothing to be nervous about. He'd seen it before. He knew exactly what his master was capable of, and exactly how little of it he'd ever choose to show. Go back and think about that first man now. The confident black belt who walked out onto the mat sure of how it would go. A straight punch, aimed dead center, thrown as hard as he could throw it. And it hit nothing but air, and a moment later there was a hand resting gentle against his cheek. That was the whole story in the very first 10 seconds. Everything that came after, the second man, the brawler, the 50 years in a shoebox, all of it was just the world slowly catching up to what that first punch already knew. Some men spend their whole lives trying to prove how dangerous they are. And then, every so often, there's a man who spends his life proving he doesn't have to. Bruce Lee stepped into a room full of people who wanted to see him fail, and he never raised his voice, and he never lost his temper, and he never once used all of what he had. He just showed them, quietly, completely, and he let the truth of it do the rest. An old man kept that truth in a box because he was afraid the world would turn it into a lie, and in the end he trusted us with it anyway. So the least we can do is remember it the way it actually happened, not the myth, the real thing. A young man, a quiet dog, a shaky camera, and 12 minutes that took 50 years to reach us.